The Heartgold Soulsilver era brought back nostalgia to a lot of Pokemon fans, as it was a callback to the Johto region with the new remakes of the original games that had just come out at this time. This era also introduced a Legend Pokemon and Pokemon Prime, two new mechanics to the TCG. Pokemon Prime featured a close-up look at the Pokemon's face and gold spikes in the border of the artwork window, while Legend cards were two halves of one card. You could not put a Pokemon Legend into play unless you had both the top and bottom half in your hand at the same time. Legend cards featured multiple legendary Pokemon in them and had extremely powerful attacks to offset the ridiculous condition required to put them into play. With that being said, let's jump into the best cards that define this era of the Pokemon trading card game. The first card on our list is Vileplume from the Undaunted expansion. This Vileplume had a really annoying ability called Allergy Flower, which prevented both players from playing any trainer cards from their hands. This effectively shut off a majority of setup strategies, as decks were almost a third item cards in this era. Vileplume was a stage 2 Pokemon, making it a little bit difficult to get into play. But with the help of cards like Broken Time Space and Rare Candy, some strategies could get this card into play in the first turn before your opponent even had a chance to play any cards. Vileplume also had an attack, Dazzling Pollen, but this attack was abysmal with its energy requirement of 2 grass and a colorless to do a measly 50 damage with a chance to do an additional 20 or confuse a defending Pokemon. Oftentimes, Vileplume wasn't even played in decks that used grass energy because the item lock strategy was so powerful on its own. One of the most famous decks in the history of the Pokemon trading card game, The Truth, was born from a strategy revolving around Vileplume. This novel deck took second place at the 2011 World Championships, and players began respecting the power of the item lock. To this day, item lock strategies have been a cornerstone of competitive play. The reason this card isn't higher up on this list is because it didn't completely stop your opponent from playing the game, but it was strong enough to leave an era-defining impact. And at number 9, we have Magnezone Prime. This card was an absolute powerhouse, boasting 140 HP, which was a lot at the time. Magnezone Prime has an extremely powerful ability, Magnetic Draw. This ability allows the player to fill their hand until they have 6 cards in their hand. This wasn't a once per turn ability, but rather once a Magnezone ability, meaning the player could fill their hand up to 6 multiple times if they had more than one Magnezone in play. Just from the ability, you're probably thinking, whoa, that card is an amazing support Pokemon, right? Magnezone had one more thing going for it in the form of its attack, Lost Burn. Lost Burn, for a lightning and colorless energy, would allow the user to do 50 times the number of energy they put into the Lost Zone from any of your Pokemon. When energy hits the Lost Zone, it's effectively removed from play, so you can't reuse those cards for the rest of the game. However, this did mean that Magnezone technically could do infinite damage if you had a full board of energies. This was an era where taking a one-hit knockout was uncommon, so Magnezone, which could one-shot anything potentially, was not only a strong support Pokemon, but also a fearsome attacker. Initially, players paired Magnezone Prime with Emboar from Black and White, which has a powerful ability, Inferno Fandango, which allows the player to attach as much fire energy they want to their Pokemon from their hand. This bypassed the 1 energy attachment per turn rule and also allowed for Magnezone to neutralize any threats on board each and every turn. This powerful combination went on to win the 2011 World Championships. Another deck that made use of Magnezone in the same era was a big toolbox deck of sorts. It paired Yanmega Prime for its ability to attack without paying the energy costs required due to its ability, Kingdra Prime, which could place damage counters on the board with its Spray Splash ability, creating perfect math for Magnezone as well as deal with the fighting type attackers that could threaten your Magnezone, and some support Pokemon. One of the support Pokemon that was so cool in this deck was Jirachi. When Jirachi was placed into play, you could flip 3 coins and for each heads, attach a psychic energy from your discard pile to this Pokemon. Normally, we don't want that energy on Jirachi, but Magnezone can take energy from Lost Burn from anywhere on the board, so we didn't mind it too much. This powerhouse of cards dominated the competitive scene while it was legal, and created some innovative strategies that were a lot of fun to play. And at number 8, we have Cleffa, a notoriously powerful setup card with an adorable Pokebody to boot. Cleffa was primarily used for its attack, Eek, which let the player shuffle their hand into the deck and draw a fresh hand of 6 for 0 energy requirement, but Cleffa was now asleep. Basically, this was a free hand reset to go deeper into your deck at this era where setup decks were so popular. Cleffa had a Pokebody that was shared by many of the baby Pokemon of this era. Sweet Sleeping Face, which said that if Cleffa was asleep, then it could prevent all damage done to it by attacks. There were very few Pokemon that could attack through this Pokebody, making Cleffa an inclusion in almost every deck. Sure, Cleffa could wake up, but the chance that a coin flip would negate your opponent's win condition by a full turn was too good to pass up. This card earns its spot on this list due to being in almost every deck at the time, as well as the best baby Pokemon in the TCG. And at 7th place on our list, we have a card that I mentioned briefly before, Yanmega Prime. Yanmega Prime was released in Triumphant and had an extremely unique Pokebody, Insight. Insight said that if you had the same number of cards in your hand, then your attacks would cost 0 energy, which is a free cost. Yanmega had 2 powerful attacks in linear attack, which did 40 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon anywhere, and Sonic Boom that did 70 damage and wasn't affected by weakness or resistance. Both of these attacks could soften up big threats for a second Yanmega to clear up or a Magnezone Prime like we mentioned earlier. Yanmega was so mobile because it also had a free retreat, meaning that you can go from one to another without any resources being used. Yanmega did have an unfortunate weakness in lightning, but the value that could be gained from the free attacking was too strong to pass up. Yanmega made its way into various strategies because of how easy it was to execute. Players could play heavy copies of Judge, which shuffled both players' hands in and drew them 4 new cards. Or Professor Oak's New Theory, which shuffled your hand in and drew 6, to simply match hands every turn and do a lot of free damage. If a deck in this format didn't know what to include as a secondary attacker, it became Yanmega Prime because of that versatility that the card provided. Its terminate dominance and flexibility earns it a spot on this list. Junk Arm is one of the strongest item cards ever released with its effect, discard 2 cards from your hand to retrieve a trainer card from your discard pile. While initially this meant that any trainer card could be grabbed, the ruling was changed to only allow item cards, excluding supports and stadiums from the possible targets. Nevertheless, this didn't change the power level of this card that allowed players to use more than 4 copies of their powerful items in a single game. Junk Arm is identical to Item Finder, which was printed in the base set, so Pokemon bringing this effect back was interesting. Almost every single deck in this era played 3 to 4 copies of Junk Arm, proving that its power level was too strong for the game to handle. This era-defining card is often lauded as one of the best competitive cards of its time, and it's easy to see why. This sort of effect may never exist again in the Pokemon TCG because of how game warping it is. All of that earns Junk Arm its spot on this list, but there's a few cards that were a bit more impactful up on the list. And at number 5, we have Shaymin, which was released in Unleash. This Pokemon has an ability called Celebration Wind, which allows the player to move around their energy on the board once this card is played from the hand. This card also has an attack Energy Bloom, which for a grass and colorless does 30 damage and heals 3 damage counters from any Pokemon that have damage counters on your board. If you were attacking with Shaymin, you were probably in a lot of trouble. Shaymin was powerful because of how quickly you could establish big threats in this format and era. One of the most powerful decks in the game's history was Darkrai EX paired with Mewtwo EX. These 2 cards had no real synergy, but were so powerful individually that it made no sense not to play them together. Mewtwo EX had an attack X-Ball that does 20 damage for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. Mewtwo EX was also weak to Psychic-type Pokemon, which meant it was weak to itself. This created a whole era of the game called Mewtwo Wars, where players would expertly maneuver their energy attachments to be the one who came out on top. One of these cards that helped it was Shaymin. Darkrai EX has an ability called Dark Cloak that allows any Pokemon with dark energy attached to retreat for free. This paired with Shaymin could get anything out of a bad situation and make your one-off energy attachment for the turn go wherever you wanted with that use of Shaymin. This card made its way back into decks of the era just to help with Mewtwo EX Wars and found itself being part of the 2012 World Championship deck. And at number 4, we have Smeargle. Smeargle was released in Undaunted and came with a Pokepower that was unlike anything the game had seen before. This Pokepower was called Portrait. It allowed the player to look at your opponent's hand and use the effective supporter card that they found there. If you found a supporter card there, you had to use the effect regardless if you wanted to or not. This was the first way to bypass using one supporter card from your turn by getting the effect of a supporter card fully available to you. This Pokepower was also not limited to once a turn, but once a Smeargle, meaning you could retreat or switch into a different Smeargle and use Portrait again to copy the same supporter card and maybe draw more cards. Players could never feel safe with a good draw-in supporter in their hand because decks in this era played multiple copies of Smeargle and could easily move between them with cards like Switch and Sky Arrow Bridge, a stadium card that allowed your basic Pokemon to have 1 less retreat costs. This game-changing card began making decks start playing heavier copies of cards, like Random Receiver, rather than supporter cards so that your opponent wouldn't be able to use their own Smeargles effectively. The mind games were real with this card, and sometimes you could even get your opponent to discard their own hand with the supporter they might not have wanted to use. This card was played in almost every deck and played a crucial part in winning the 2012 World Championships paired with Darkrai EX and Mewtwo EX. This era-defining card barely misses the top 3, because the 3 cards above were truly revolutionary. And at number 3, we have Professor Oak's New Theory. This card was a supporter card that was a deviation from the norm with its effect. Professor Oak's New Theory allowed the player to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw 6 new cards with no drawback. This was a simple effect but conserved resources because players did not want to discard too many crucial cards in this time period. Smeargle would also love to use its Portrait ability on this supporter card because it gave the player a fresh hand of 6 without using their supporter for the turn. This card was played in heavy numbers, almost maxed out in every deck at the time. While Professor Oak isn't the professor in Johto, he's still the original Pokemon professor for most of us. A few years later, Pokemon liked this effect so much, they brought it back verbatim on the supporter card Cynthia. Just as you may have expected, Cynthia became a staple card in almost every deck. And this time, there was no Smeargle to worry about. With the only other real options of the era being Professor's Research and Judge, this card would help set up your board and had absolutely 0 drawbacks for the 6 cards that you saw. Saving resources in a card game is one of the most important things at the highest level, and that's why this card quickly rose to the top. And at number 2, we have Pokemon Collector. This card was one of the most impactful cards of its release because of its incredibly powerful effect. Pokemon Collector allows the player to look through their deck to grab any 3 basic Pokemon and put them into their hand. This allowed the player to grab any of their early game setup Pokemon or supporter Pokemon to keep strategies moving. This wasn't the first instance of a card effect like this that existed in the Pokemon trading card game. Hole Mentor did almost the exact same thing, but the Pokemon had to be below 100 HP. This was slightly restrictive to grabbing the main attackers that a deck needed, but now we had something better with 0 restrictions. Later in Pokemon's history, we had cards with similar effects printed like Professor Oak's setup, which had the restriction of needing to grab Pokemon of all different types, and Gloria, which grabbed 3 basics without a rule box tag. This proved that Pokemon realized that this type of effect was far too strong without a restriction and tried to correct their mistakes. Collector was played in almost every single deck at the time, making it one of the most staple supporters during its lifetime. This was taken advantage of very easily. Let me explain. Remember our good friend Smeargle from earlier? The card with Portrait that allows you to copy a support in your opponent's hand? This card kept getting copied over and over again by Smeargle, and players didn't even have to play their own copy of Pokemon Collector to set up. That seems pretty strong. Towards the end of its life cycle, this led to players switching up their collectors for the riskier option in Dual Ball, which said that players flip 2 coins and for each heads, grab a basic Pokemon from their deck. A much riskier way to grab Pokemon as a double tails meant you got literally nothing. This kind of effect can probably come back to the TCG in some capacity, but I doubt we'll ever see it again without a restriction. And at number 1, we have Twins. Twins is at the top of this list for being the most era-defining card. Twins was a supporter card that can only be played when the player using it was behind on prize cards, and allowed the player to get any 2 cards from their deck to their hand. Getting any 2 cards is an absolutely insane effect, no matter what kind of card game you're playing or any strategy you're using. Twins brought about the birth of decks that could play from behind and create these crazy comeback mechanics. Twins was often played in low counts, but the first real instance of the card being played in heavy counts was in the 2011 World Championship finalist deck, The Truth. This deck that we mentioned before centered around getting Vileplume up and stopping your opponent from setting up their game plan while progressing yours. But how did the deck do that while having to maneuver under an item lock? The answer was Twins. With Twins, you could chain them back to back without ever taking a prize card until you were ready. Twins also played in the 2011 World Championship winning deck as well as a Magna board to set up those quick Magnezone Primes and M boards. Basically, any deck that required setting up big threats could utilize this card while sitting behind a Cleffa to keep digging through the deck. An incredibly powerful card whose effect was never reprinted in any capacity in the Pokemon TCG. Widely regarded as one of the best comeback cards of all time, Twins defined the cards of this setup deck era. This was one of the last times that Stage 2 decks had as much success as they did before the game changed a direction that favored big basic Pokemon. Were Stage 2 decks successful because of this card, or were they powerful enough on their own? I'd argue this card really cemented those decks at the top of the table. This was an era-defining card and a great champion of the Heartgold Soulsilver era. And there you have it. Do you think we missed anything important, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.